The shuttle's warning system screamed as it spun through the atmosphere like a broken toy. David Reed gripped his seat harness and watched the ground rush toward him through the cracked viewport. He had been flying supply runs between colonies for 8 years, but this was different. The engine failure had come without warning, and now he was falling toward an unknown planet that wasn't supposed to exist. The impact threw him against the cabin wall. Metal groaned and sparked around him as the shuttle carved a deep furrow through purple grass, before finally stopping against a cluster of silver trees. Steam hissed from damaged systems, and the acrid smell of burned electronics filled the air. David shook his head to clear it and ran through his emergency checklist. Life support was failing. The communications array was completely destroyed, and his emergency beacon had been crushed in the crash. He gathered what supplies he could carry and stepped outside into an alien world. 2 suns hung in a lavender sky, casting strange double shadows across rolling hills covered in vegetation that looked almost too perfect. The air was breathable according to his scanner, though it carried unfamiliar scents that reminded him of cinnamon and rain. In the distance, crystalline formations jutted from the ground like frozen lightning, and the sound of running water suggested streams or rivers nearby. What struck David most was how quiet everything seemed. No insect buzzing, no bird calls, no rustling in the undergrowth, just an eerie stillness that made his skin crawl. He had crash-landed on dozens of worlds during his military service, and they were never this silent. Something was wrong here, though he couldn't put his finger on what. As he explored the immediate area around his crashed shuttle, David found traces of other crashed vehicles, scorch marks on rocks, scattered metal debris, even what looked like the remains of escape pods from different species. None of it was recent, but it painted a disturbing picture. This planet seemed to collect crashed ships like some kind of graveyard. The first sign of life came as the larger sun began to set. A soft chittering sound echoed from a grove of trees about 100 meters from his shuttle. David approached carefully, his hand resting on the plasma pistol at his hip. The chittering grew louder, and he could hear what sounded like distress calls in some alien language his universal translator couldn't identify. Behind a fallen log, David found them. 3 small creatures about the size of house cats, covered in soft blue fur with enormous dark eyes that reflected the dying sunlight. They looked up at him without fear, which surprised him more than their appearance. Most wild animals fled from unfamiliar predators, but these little beings seemed almost relieved to see him. His translator finally kicked in as one of them spoke in a high, musical voice. "Big person? Big person, help us? Pack leader's gone during ground shaking. We are lost and scared." David knelt down slowly, keeping his movements gentle. The creatures reminded him of the puppies his daughter used to rescue back on Earth, all wide eyes and helpless vulnerability. "Where did your pack leaders go?" he asked. Ground shook very bad. Many loud noises from sky. Pack leaders went to find safe place but never came back. We waited and waited, but stomach hurts from no food, and the cold makes fur wet. Looking around the grove, David could see signs of recent disturbance. Broken branches, disturbed earth, and what might have been tracks leading away toward the crystalline formations in the distance. Whatever had happened here, these young ones had been left behind. The logical part of his mind warned him that getting involved with alien wildlife was against protocol. He had limited supplies and no way to call for rescue. Every ration pack he shared was one less meal for his own survival. But David had never been good at following protocol when children were involved. These weren't children in the human sense, but something about their helpless trust reminded him of every kid he'd ever helped during disaster relief missions. He pulled out one of his emergency ration packs and broke it into small pieces. "Here," he said, offering the food. "This will help with the hungry feeling." The 3 creatures approached cautiously at first, then devoured the rations with obvious relief. They chattered among themselves in their musical language, occasionally looking up at David with what he could only interpret as gratitude. When they finished eating, the largest of the 3 creatures approached him and gently touched his hand with a small, soft paw. "Big person is kind. Big person has warm heart like pack leaders. Will you help us find them?" David looked at his remaining supplies, then at the alien landscape stretching in all directions. He should be focused on finding water, building shelter, and signaling for rescue. Getting involved in some kind of alien family drama was the last thing he needed. But those enormous eyes looked at him with such trust, such hope, that he found himself nodding before his rational mind could object. "I'll help you look for your pack leaders," he heard himself saying. But first we need to make sure you're safe and warm for the night. As the two suns finally disappeared below the horizon, David found himself building a shelter not just for one stranded human, but for 3 lost alien young who had somehow decided he was worth trusting. He used his emergency blankets to create a warm space near his shuttle, shared another ration pack for dinner, and even rigged up a small heating unit to keep them comfortable through the night. The creatures curled up together near the heat source, making soft, contented sounds as they drifted off to sleep. David sat nearby, keeping watch and trying to figure out what he'd gotten himself into. Tomorrow he would start looking for their missing pack, even though every survival instinct told him it was a mistake. But as he watched the 3 small forms breathing peacefully in the artificial warmth, he knew he couldn't have made any other choice. High above in orbital platforms hidden by advanced cloaking technology, beings from across the galaxy watched the humans' first day on Sanctuary 7 with growing interest. Most species lasted only hours before abandoning any local wildlife to focus on their own survival. This human had already broken that pattern in ways that surprised even the most experienced observers. The test had only just begun. 3 days had passed since David first found the lost cubs, and his search for their missing pack had led him deeper into the planet's strange landscape. The blue-furred creatures, who called themselves kits, had attached themselves to him completely. They followed him everywhere, chattering in their musical language and pointing out interesting rocks or plants along the way. Despite his dwindling supplies, David found their company oddly comforting in this silent world. Walking along what appeared to be an ancient riverbed, David heard new sounds echoing from a series of caves carved into the canyon wall. Not the musical chittering of his kit companions, but something deeper and more distressed. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness and unfamiliar calls bounced off stone walls. The kits pressed closer to his legs, their fur standing on end as they sensed something that made them nervous. David activated his flashlight and peered into the largest cave opening. The beam revealed smooth walls covered in what looked like algae or fungus, and pools of water scattered across the floor. In the farthest pool, something moved. Something that definitely wasn't native to dry land. "Hello?" David called out, his voice echoing strangely in the cavern. "Is someone in there?" A splash answered him, followed by a sound his translator interpreted as sobbing. David waded carefully into the cave, testing each step on the slippery stone floor. The kits remained at the entrance, too frightened to follow but unwilling to leave him completely. In the deepest pool, David found them. A dozen creatures that looked like a cross between frogs and dolphins, each about the size of a human child. Their skin was a pale green that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, and their large eyes were clearly adapted for underwater vision. They huddled together in the center of the pool, making distressed calls that his translator was struggling to interpret. "Big Landwalker," one of them finally spoke clearly enough for the device to process. "You are not like the others who came before. Your smell is different. Are you here to help or to hunt?" David knelt at the edge of the pool, careful to keep his voice calm and non-threatening. "I'm here to help if I can. What happened to you? Where are your adults?" The young amphibian who had spoken swam closer, though she remained ready to dive at the first sign of danger. "The skyfire came 3 sleeping times ago. Big rocks fell from above and blocked the water paths back to our deep homes. We swim and swim but cannot find way through the stones. Our pod leaders went to move the rocks but did not return. We grow weak without flowing water and proper food." Looking around the cave, David could see what she meant. These pools were stagnant, probably fed by a trickle of groundwater rather than the flowing streams these creatures needed. They were slowly dying in what amounted to a series of puddles, waiting for help that might never come. David's rational mind once again pointed out that he was now responsible for 3 lost kits and had barely enough supplies for himself. Adding 12 aquatic aliens to his group was beyond irresponsible. It was potentially suicidal. But looking at these frightened young beings, seeing how they struggled to keep their delicate skin moist in the stagnant pools, he found himself already planning how to help them. "I might be able to find you better water," he said. "There are streams not far from here, but you'd have to trust me and leave these pools." The young amphibians exchanged glances, communicating in rapid squeaks and clicks that his translator couldn't follow. Finally, their spokeswoman swam back to the edge. "We will die here if we stay. We will follow the strange landwalker if he promises to try." David spent the next several hours rigging up a transport system. He used his emergency shelter material to create a series of water-filled slings that could keep the amphibians moist during travel. It meant giving up his weather protection, but the climate seemed stable enough to risk it. The kits helped by gathering soft moss to line the carriers and chattering encouragement to the nervous water dwellers. The journey to the nearest stream took most of the day. David carried 4 of the amphibians while the kits helped steady the makeshift carriers. The creatures were heavier than they looked, and by the time they reached flowing water, David's arms ached and his back screamed in protest. But the joy on the young amphibians' faces as they slipped into the clear, moving stream made every step worthwhile. "Water sings," one of them called out as they began swimming freely for the first time in days. "Current flows. Fish taste good again." The amphibians, who called themselves flow children, immediately began teaching the kits how to catch small fish in the shallows. Despite being completely different species, the young beings seemed to have no trouble communicating through gestures and shared play. David found himself smiling as he watched them splash and chase each other in the stream. That evening, as David shared another precious ration pack among his growing group of refugees, he heard new sounds from the forest beyond the stream, mechanical whirring mixed with what sounded like electronic distress calls. The flow children dove deeper into the water for safety while the kits clustered around David's legs. Following the sounds, David discovered the strangest members of his growing collection yet. 3 small robots, each about the size of a human toddler, were stuck in a tangle of vines near a stand of metal trees. Their chrome shells were scratched and dented, and several of their optical sensors flickered erratically. When they saw David approaching, they immediately began broadcasting what his translator identified as emergency protocols. Unit requests assistance. Primary care unit has been offline for 73 standard hours. Secondary systems failing. Unit requires maintenance and direction. David had some experience with field repairs from his military days, but these robots were clearly built by an alien species with completely different technology. Still, some problems were universal. Low power, tangled mechanical parts, and confused programming were issues he'd seen before. Working by the light of his flashlight, David carefully untangled the robots from the vines and performed basic diagnostics. 2 of them had simply run out of power and needed charging from his shuttle's emergency batteries. The third had damaged emotional processing circuits that made it panic every few minutes. But David managed to bypass the worst of the errors with some creative rewiring. "Unit expresses gratitude," the repaired robot said once David finished his work. "Unit designated as Learning Unit 7. These units are Learning Unit 5 and Learning Unit 3. We were separated from Primary Care Unit during seismic event. Do you function as temporary Primary Care Unit?" David looked at his bizarre collection of alien refugees. 3 furry kits who trusted him completely, 12 aquatic flow children who treated him like a hero, and now 3 robot children who wanted him to be their parent. His food supplies wouldn't last another week feeding this many mouths. He had no idea how to properly care for any of them, and he still hadn't found a way to signal for rescue. But as the robot children began interacting with the kits and flow children, sharing data about edible plants and safe camping spots, David realized something important. These young beings weren't just his responsibility now. They were becoming a team. Each group brought different skills and knowledge, and together they might actually have a better chance of survival than any of them would have alone. As he settled in for another night under alien stars, David found himself surrounded by sleeping creatures from 3 different species, all of whom had decided he was worth following. He should have been terrified by the responsibility. Instead, he felt something he hadn't expected to feel on this strange world. He felt like he was home. The ground beneath David's feet trembled as he knelt beside a stream, filling water containers for his growing group of alien companions. What started as a gentle vibration quickly became a violent shaking that sent the flow children diving for deeper water and made the kits cry out in alarm. The 3 robot children immediately began broadcasting sensor readings in overlapping voices. Seismic activity detected. Magnitude increasing. Geological instability probable. Recommend immediate relocation to secure position. David had felt earthquakes before, but this was different. The shaking came in waves, each one stronger than the last, and it seemed to be spreading across the entire continent. In the distance, one of the crystalline formations that dotted the landscape suddenly exploded in a shower of glittering fragments. A column of smoke began rising from beyond the horizon, and the smell of sulfur drifted on the wind. Everyone stay together. David called out as he helped the flow children out of the stream and into their portable carriers. "We need to find shelter until this stops." But it didn't stop. As they made their way toward higher ground, David watched the landscape transform around them. Cracks appeared in the earth, releasing jets of steam and strange gases. The silver trees began to sway despite the lack of wind, their metallic leaves ringing like bells. Most disturbing of all, David began to spot artificial structures emerging from hidden underground positions. Scanning equipment rose from camouflaged bunkers. Observation towers extended telescoping masts toward the sky. What had appeared to be natural rock formations revealed themselves as sophisticated monitoring stations, their surfaces bristling with sensors and communication arrays. David stopped walking and stared at the nearest installation, a growing suspicion forming in his mind. Learning Unit 7, he called to the most talkative of the robot children. "Can you identify that equipment?" The small robot's optical sensors focused on the monitoring station, cycling through different detection modes. Equipment identified as Council Standard Observation Platform Type 7, designed for long-term species behavioral analysis. Unit notes significant cloaking technology consistent with Galactic Council testing protocols. David felt his blood turn cold. The Galactic Council. He'd heard rumors about their testing programs during his military service, whispered stories about planets that weren't what they seemed. Worlds where crashed ships and stranded beings were observed and evaluated according to criteria no one fully understood. Most spacers dismissed the stories as paranoid fantasy, but standing here watching hidden technology emerge from the ground, David knew the truth. This was all a test. His crash, the convenient placement of young aliens from different species, even the perfect breathable atmosphere. Everything had been arranged to see how he would react when faced with helpless beings in need of protection. The realization should have filled him with rage, but instead, David felt something far more dangerous. A cold, calculating anger that reminded him of his worst days in the military. These aliens hadn't crashed here. They'd been placed here. Someone had deliberately separated children from their families and scattered them across this planet to serve as bait in some kind of galactic examination. The kits weren't lost because of an earthquake. The flow children weren't trapped because of falling rocks. They were here because someone had decided their suffering was acceptable if it served a scientific purpose. "You're watching me," David said aloud, looking directly at the nearest monitoring station. "You put these children here to see what I'd do. You want to know if humans are worth something to your precious council." The kits clustered around his legs, sensing his anger but not understanding its source. The flow children made worried chirping sounds from their carriers, and the robot children began analyzing his elevated stress signals. None of them knew they were test subjects in some cosmic experiment. They just knew the big human who'd been taking care of them was upset about something. The earthquake reached a new level of intensity, and David realized this was part of the test too. The crisis was being artificially escalated to see how he'd react under pressure. Would he abandon the alien children to save himself? Would he choose favorites based on which species seemed most valuable? Or would he break under the stress and prove that humans weren't worth council membership after all? A new sound echoed across the landscape, a deep rumbling that seemed to come from everywhere at once. On the horizon, David could see volcanic activity beginning in several locations. Lava flows started carving bright orange paths down distant mountainsides, and ash began to darken the sky. The air grew thicker and harder to breathe, and the temperature started rising noticeably. "Primary Care Unit," Learning Unit 7 said, its voice tinged with artificial concern. "Current environmental conditions suggest planetary evacuation protocols should be initiated. Local geological activity indicates catastrophic system failure imminent." David looked at his collection of alien children, then at the monitoring stations that were undoubtedly recording his every word and action. The scientists watching this drama unfold probably expected him to panic now, to realize the situation was hopeless and try to save only himself. They designed their test to be impossible. No single being could protect this many vulnerable aliens during a planetary disaster. But they'd made one critical mistake in their assumptions about humans. They thought the impossibility of success would deter him. Instead, it just made him angry enough to try anyway. "Change of plans," David announced to his group. "We're not just finding shelter anymore. We're finding every lost child on this planet and getting them all to safety." The kits looked at him with confusion. The flow children chirped questions his translator couldn't interpret, and the robot children began calculating probability matrices that undoubtedly showed his plan had virtually no chance of success. But David had stopped caring about odds or logic or what the council observers expected him to do. Somewhere on this planet were the pack leaders the kits were still hoping to find. Somewhere were the adult flow children who'd gone to move rocks and never returned. Somewhere were the primary care units the robot children were programmed to obey. David strongly suspected these adults were either dead or deliberately kept away as part of the test parameters. But if there were more young ones scattered across the planet, separated from their families and left to face this artificial disaster alone, then David was going to find them. All of them. The council wanted to see what humans would do when tested. He'd show them exactly what one human could accomplish when someone threatened children under his protection. As volcanic ash began falling like snow and the ground shook with increasing violence, David started planning the most ambitious rescue mission of his life. The observers in their hidden stations were about to learn something about human nature that no amount of scientific analysis could have predicted. When children were in danger, humans didn't calculate odds or consider personal safety. They just started running toward the danger, carrying whoever they could reach, and refused to stop until everyone was safe, even if it killed them in the process. Volcanic ash fell steadily as David led his group across the increasingly unstable landscape, following signals his improvised scanner had detected from other crashed vessels. The robot children had helped him modify his emergency equipment to scan for distress beacons, life signs, and even the specific energy signatures that different species used in their technology. What they'd found painted a disturbing picture of just how extensive this test really was. At least 30 different crash sites dotted the continent, each containing the wreckage of ships from species David had never heard of. More importantly, each site showed signs of survivors who had been separated from their young during the artificial disasters that had been triggered across the planet. The scope of the Council's experiment was staggering. They hadn't just grabbed a few alien children for their test. They'd orchestrated the destruction of entire family groups just to see how David would react. The first new group they found was huddled in the remains of what looked like a crystalline escape pod. 5 young beings that resembled living gemstones, their bodies made of some kind of translucent mineral that rang like bells when they moved. They were trying to sing to each other, producing harmonies that made the air shimmer, but their voices were weak and their colors were fading. Harmonic juveniles detected, Learning Unit 7 announced as they approached. Species designation unknown, but structural analysis suggests silicon-based life forms requiring specific mineral nutrients and resonance frequencies for proper development. The crystal children looked up at David with what he assumed were eyes, though they appeared more like faceted windows into inner light. When he spoke to them, they responded with chiming sounds that his translator struggled to interpret. Stone singer? You are not crystal-born, but you carry the small warm ones who sing in fur voices. Do you seek the bright places where songs echo properly? David knelt beside their damaged pod, noting the sophisticated technology that had kept them alive this long. I'm looking for any young ones who are lost or in danger. Are you hurt? Do you need help? The largest crystal child, whose body sparkled with veins of gold, chimed a complex melody that gradually resolved into words. We search for the deep singers who guide us in the learning of proper songs. The ground shaking broke our song cave, and we have wandered in silence since the breaking time. Our inner lights grow dim without proper harmonic resonance. Looking at their fading glow, David realized these beings were slowly dying without whatever specific conditions they needed. But the kits immediately began chittering encouragement, and the flow children made musical sounds from their carriers that seemed to brighten the crystal children slightly. Even the robot children started producing harmonic tones from their speakers, creating an impromptu chorus that made the crystal being's inner light pulse stronger. We need to keep you with others who can make music, David decided. Maybe together we can find what you need. As they traveled, David's strange caravan grew more diverse and more challenging to manage. They found a group of 6 plant-like children rooted beside a poisoned stream, their leaf structures wilted and their photosynthetic processes failing. David had to carefully transplant them into portable containers filled with clean soil and water, then rig up artificial lighting using power cells from crashed ships. In a crashed atmospheric shuttle, they discovered 4 young flyers whose wings had been damaged in the impact. Their species resembled a cross between birds and bats with delicate bone structures and sophisticated echolocation abilities. They were terrified of ground travel and kept trying to flutter upward on damaged wings. But the kits quickly figured out how to calm them with gentle grooming, and the robot children calculated optimal wind patterns to help them glide short distances. Each new group brought different challenges. The plant children needed specific soil minerals and carefully controlled water pH. The crystal children required harmonic resonance to maintain their energy levels. The flying children needed elevated perches and couldn't tolerate being underground. The flow children had to stay moist and required moving water. The kits were pack animals who became stressed when separated. The robot children needed regular data exchanges and became confused without clear hierarchical structures. By any logical measure, David's rescue mission was impossible. He was trying to care for 37 young beings from 12 different species, each with completely different biological and psychological needs. His food supplies had run out days ago, forcing him to rely on the plant children's ability to identify edible vegetation and the robot children's analysis of nutritional content. His equipment was failing, his clothes were torn, and he'd sustained injuries from falling debris that made every step painful. But something remarkable was happening within his diverse group of refugees. The different species were learning to help each other in ways their adult counterparts probably never would have imagined. The kits used their pack hunting instincts to find food for everyone. The flow children caught fish and filtered water for the group. The crystal children learned to modulate their harmonic frequencies to calm stressed members of other species. The robot children became mobile data processing centers, helping translate between groups and calculate optimal travel routes. Most importantly, they all seemed to understand that the strange human who had found them was completely committed to protecting them. David carried the youngest and weakest when they couldn't keep up. He gave up his remaining equipment to provide shelter and medical care. He stayed awake during the dangerous night hours to keep watch while they slept. When food was scarce, he made sure everyone else ate first. The planet's artificial crisis continued to escalate around them. Volcanic activity increased, ash clouds blocked out the suns for hours at a time, and massive earthquakes opened new chasms across the landscape. The Council's monitoring stations became more obvious as the emergency intensified, their sophisticated sensors tracking every move David's group made across the dying world. But David had stopped caring about being observed. His focus had narrowed to one simple priority: get these children to safety no matter what it cost him personally. When they found a group of amphibious young trapped in a rapidly evaporating lake, David waded into the toxic water without hesitation to carry them out. When falling rocks threatened the plant children's delicate root systems, he used his own body as a shield while the robot children calculated safe paths through the debris field. The Council observers in their hidden stations watched with growing amazement as David's rescue mission defied every statistical model they'd created. No test subject in their records had ever attempted to save this many individuals from different species. Most focused on their own survival or, at best, showed preference for beings that resembled their own kind. But this human seemed incapable of abandoning anyone, regardless of species, biological compatibility, or practical considerations. When his equipment failed, he improvised new solutions. When his supplies ran out, he found ways to make do with whatever the environment provided. When the physical demands exceeded what should have been possible for a single individual, he simply refused to acknowledge the limitations. As David's group finally reached the edge of a massive canyon system that might provide shelter from the volcanic ash, they numbered over 90 young beings from 18 different species. Some could barely walk. Others needed to be carried in specialized containers, and a few required constant medical attention that David provided with improvised equipment and determination that bordered on the supernatural. Looking down into the canyon, David could see caves that might be large enough to shelter everyone, and underground streams that could support the aquatic species. It looked like sanctuary if they could find a way down the steep walls without losing anyone. The Council's test was approaching its climax, but David wasn't thinking about tests or alien politics anymore. He was calculating rope lengths and weight distributions, planning how to get 93 individuals safely down a cliff face while volcanic ash fell around them like snow. It was impossible, but he'd been doing impossible things for days now. That was what humans did when children were counting on them. They found a way. The descent into the canyon became a nightmare of improvised engineering and desperate courage. David had rigged together climbing ropes from salvaged cable, crash webbing, and even strips of his own clothing to create a pulley system that could lower the most vulnerable members of his group to safety. The ashfall had intensified into a choking blizzard that made breathing difficult and visibility almost zero. But the canyon offered their only hope of protection from the volcanic debris raining down across the landscape. The plant children went first, secured in their portable containers and lowered carefully to avoid damage to their delicate root systems. David's hands were raw and bleeding from handling the improvised ropes, but he maintained steady pressure as each precious cargo disappeared into the gray haze below. The robot children calculated optimal descent angles and weight distributions, their mechanical voices providing a calm counterpoint to the chaos of the dying world above. Descent angle optimal. Load stress within acceptable parameters. Recommend continued operations despite deteriorating environmental conditions. Learning Unit 7 reported, as David prepared the next group for lowering. The flow children were more challenging, requiring their water-filled carriers to remain level throughout the descent. David had to modify his pulley system between each trip, adjusting for different weights and requirements. His engineering solutions were crude but effective, born from desperation and the absolute refusal to lose anyone under his protection. The crystal children created their own problems. Their harmonic songs helped keep the group calm during the dangerous descent, but their mineral bodies were heavier than they looked, and their surfaces were too slippery for conventional rope holds. David ended up wrapping them in padding salvaged from crash sites, creating makeshift cocoons that could be safely lowered without damage. By the time David had gotten 60 of his charges down to the canyon floor, his improvised equipment was failing and his own strength was nearly exhausted. The volcanic ash had turned day into twilight, and the temperature was rising as lava flows carved new paths across the plateau above. But the most challenging part of the rescue still lay ahead. In a collapsed shelter near the canyon's edge, they'd found the last group of stranded young. 8 aquatic beings similar to the flow children, but much smaller, trapped in a rapidly draining pool that was all that remained of their ship's life support systems. The water was contaminated with chemicals from the damaged vessel, and the pool would be completely dry within hours. These were the youngest survivors David had encountered, barely more than tadpoles, unable to survive outside of water for more than a few minutes. Getting them down the canyon wall would require a completely different approach, and David's equipment was already pushed beyond its limits. Water containers insufficient for extended transport. Learning Unit 7 analyzed. Atmospheric conditions deteriorating beyond safe parameters. Recommend immediate evacuation of current rescue subject and priority focus on subjects already secured. David looked at the robot child with something approaching anger. The mechanical being was only following logical protocols, but logic had never been David's strong suit when children were involved. We're not leaving them. We find a way to get everyone down, or nobody goes. Working with desperate creativity, David dismantled the remaining life support systems from nearby crash sites, creating a sealed water transport that could keep the aquatic young alive during the descent. It meant cannibalizing equipment that might have been useful for other purposes, but David had long since stopped thinking about anything beyond the immediate needs of his charges. The improvised aquarium was heavy and awkward, requiring a completely different rigging system that took precious time to construct. As David worked, the kits helped by gathering soft materials for padding, while the crystal children provided harmonic frequencies that seemed to keep the trapped aquatic young calm despite their deteriorating environment. The first attempt to lower the water container failed when one of David's improvised pulleys gave way under the weight. The container swung wildly against the canyon wall, and only quick action by the robot children prevented it from shattering completely. David's backup equipment was even more marginal, held together by determination and prayer more than proper engineering. Let me carry them down, David finally decided, strapping the water container to his back and preparing to rappel down the canyon wall manually. It was insanely dangerous, but his improvised pulley system simply couldn't handle the weight and precision required. The descent became a controlled fall through clouds of volcanic ash and rising heat. David's rope was too short, forcing him to make intermediate stops on narrow ledges where he had to reset his anchors and continue downward. The water container on his back threw off his balance, and several times he nearly lost his grip on the increasingly frayed rope. Halfway down the canyon wall, disaster struck. A section of the cliff face, weakened by the constant seismic activity, broke away just as David was setting a new anchor point. He fell 15 feet before his emergency line caught, slamming him against the rocky wall with enough force to crack ribs and drive the breath from his lungs. The water container remained intact, but David's rope was severely damaged and his own injuries made continuing the descent nearly impossible. He hung suspended in the ash-filled air, feeling his strength ebbing away as the young aquatic beings in the container behind him made distressed sounds that cut through his pain like knives. Below him on the canyon floor, his collection of alien refugees looked up through the gray haze, their various voices raised in calls of concern and encouragement. The kits were chittering frantically. The flow children were singing worry songs, and even the robot children were broadcasting emotional support protocols. They could see their protector was in trouble, but there was nothing they could do to help. David forced himself to continue downward, using techniques from his military climbing training to compensate for the damaged rope and his own injuries. Each movement sent waves of pain through his damaged ribs, and he could feel blood running down his arms from rope burns and cuts. But the sounds from the container on his back reminded him that 8 small lives depended on him reaching the bottom alive. The final 20 feet of descent pushed David beyond the limits of human endurance. His rope finally gave way completely, and he fell the last distance using his own body to cushion the impact for the aquatic young he carried. The landing drove him to his knees and left him gasping for breath, but the container remained sealed and intact. As his diverse collection of alien refugees surrounded him with sounds of relief and celebration, David realized he'd done something that should have been impossible. 96 young beings from 19 different species, all safely gathered in the canyon sanctuary he'd found for them. Every single individual he'd encountered during his impossible journey across the dying planet. But even as the young aliens celebrated their reunion in the relative safety of the canyon, David could see new dangers approaching. Lava flows were beginning to pour over the plateau above, and the ashfall was getting so thick that breathing was becoming difficult even in their shelter. The Council's test was entering its final phase, and David suspected the worst was yet to come. Looking up at the rim of the canyon where volcanic fires painted the ash clouds in hellish orange light, David made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would get these children off this planet, even if he had to carry every single one of them to safety personally. The Council wanted to see what humans were capable of under pressure. They were about to find out that some lines simply couldn't be crossed, not while a human still drew breath. The lava reached the canyon rim, just as David finished sealing the deepest cave system with debris and salvaged equipment. The improvised shelter would protect his 96 charges from the worst of the heat and toxic gases, but David knew it was only a temporary solution. The planet's artificial destruction was accelerating beyond anything natural, geological processes could explain, and his makeshift sanctuary wouldn't hold forever. Inside the cave, bioluminescent fungi provided enough light to see the remarkable sight his rescue mission had created. Young beings from 19 different species huddled together in small mixed groups, sharing warmth and comfort across biological boundaries that their adult cultures would probably never cross. Kits groomed the delicate wing membranes of young flyers. Crystal children provided harmonic healing frequencies for injured plant younglings. Robot children shared power with damaged mechanical units from other ships, while flow children kept everyone's water supplies clean and fresh. David sat against the cave wall, his injuries making every breath painful, but his mind still working on the problem of their ultimate escape. The planet was dying around them, but he'd noticed something important about the timing of the disasters. They were too coordinated, too perfectly escalated to be natural. Someone was controlling the destruction, which meant someone could also stop it. Learning Unit 7, he called to the most advanced of the robot children. "Can you analyze the seismic patterns and volcanic activity for artificial control signatures?" The small robot's optical sensors brightened as it processed the request. Analyzing available data, seismic events show mathematical precision inconsistent with natural geological processes. Volcanic eruptions initiated at calculated intervals. Environmental destruction appears to be remotely managed by sophisticated planetary engineering systems. David nodded grimly. The council wasn't just observing his response to a natural disaster. They were actively orchestrating the crisis, fine-tuning the level of threat to push him toward whatever breaking point they wanted to measure. The realization filled him with a cold rage that surprised him with its intensity. Can you locate the control systems? Probability analysis suggests primary control hub located in underground installation, approximately 12 kilometers from current position. Installation appears heavily shielded, but shows significant power emissions consistent with planetary modification technology. David looked around the cave at his collection of alien refugees. Leaving them here while he attempted to reach the control installation would be abandoning everything he'd worked for. But staying here meant watching them all die slowly as the planet's atmosphere became increasingly toxic. Neither option was acceptable. "We're going after the control systems," he announced to the cave in general. "All of us together." The response was immediate and varied. The kits chittered their agreement, ready to follow their adopted pack leader anywhere. The Flow children sang harmonies that his translator interpreted as determination. The Crystal children chimed their willingness to face danger for the group. Even the youngest and weakest members of his diverse family voiced their support in whatever ways their species allowed. But it was Learning Unit 7 who voiced the logical objection. Probability of mission success with 96 individuals of varying mobility decreases to statistically negligible levels. Recommend primary unit proceed alone while remaining subjects maintain defensive positions in current shelter. David shook his head. "I'm not leaving anyone behind. We started this together and we're finishing it together. If the council wants to see what humans do under pressure, they're going to see all of it." The journey through the tunnel systems beneath the planet's surface became an underground exodus that challenged every leadership skill David had developed during his military service. He had to scout ahead for safe passages while simultaneously coordinating the movement of beings who traveled at completely different speeds and had radically different environmental needs. The robot children formed the advance guard, their sensors detecting dangerous gases and unstable cave sections before the biological members of the group could be harmed. The Crystal children provided light and used their resonance abilities to test the stability of tunnel walls. The plant children could detect underground water sources and identify edible fungi, while the Flow children kept everyone's water supplies filtered and clean. But it was the kits who truly held the group together during the grueling underground march. Their pack instincts made them natural organizers, and they seemed to understand instinctively which individuals needed help and encouragement. They groomed the stressed flyers, played gentle games with the youngest aquatic beings, and even learned to mimic the harmonics that comforted the Crystal children. After 18 hours of underground travel, they finally reached the installation Learning Unit 7 had detected. The massive chamber opened before them like an underground cathedral, filled with technology so advanced that it seemed almost magical. Holographic displays showed real-time planetary conditions, while control interfaces managed everything from tectonic activity to atmospheric composition. But the chamber wasn't empty. Beings from dozens of different species stood at observation stations, their attention focused on displays showing David's rescue mission from multiple angles. The hidden observers had faces David didn't recognize, but their body language was universally shocked. Whatever they'd expected to see during their test, it clearly wasn't a human arriving at their control center with nearly 100 alien children in tow. "The test is over," David announced, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "Turn off your planetary destruction systems and let these children contact their families." The nearest observer, a tall being with crystalline features similar to the young ones David had rescued, turned to face him with obvious amazement. "Impossible. No test subject has ever reached the primary observation center. The parameters of the examination specifically prevent direct contact between subjects and evaluators." David looked around the chamber at the faces of beings from across the galaxy, all staring at him and his impossible collection of rescued aliens. "Your parameters didn't account for someone who refuses to abandon children, regardless of the cost. You wanted to see human instincts under pressure? Here they are. We protect the young. All of them. No matter what." Another observer, this one resembling the Flow children, spoke in harmonics that the universal translator interpreted as profound confusion. The probability matrices indicated mission failure within the first planetary cycle. No single individual can maintain protective custody of this many cross-species juveniles during a coordinated environmental crisis. "Watch me," David replied simply. What followed was unlike anything in the Council's testing protocols. Instead of a formal evaluation process, David found himself surrounded by alien scientists and politicians who peppered him with questions about his decision-making process, his motivations, and his species' biological imperatives. They seemed genuinely unable to understand how any being could prioritize the welfare of genetically unrelated individuals over personal survival. But it was the young aliens themselves who provided the most compelling testimony. One by one, they approached the Council observers and told their stories in their own voices. They described how the strange human had found them, cared for them, and refused to abandon them even when helping them put his own life at risk. They spoke of shared food when he had little, improvised medical care when they were injured, and constant protection when the world around them was literally falling apart. The Council's debate lasted for hours while David's rescued aliens played together in the observation chamber, their various species continuing to interact with the easy acceptance of the very young. Finally, the lead observer, a being David couldn't identify but who radiated obvious authority, approached him directly. "The Council finds itself in unprecedented circumstances," the being said. "No species in our records has ever demonstrated this level of protective instinct toward genetically unrelated young. Your actions during the evaluation period indicate behavioral patterns that exceed our theoretical models for altruistic behavior." David felt his anger returning. "You separated children from their families to run an experiment. You put them in danger to see how I'd react. If you want to talk about behavioral patterns, let's start with that." "The juveniles were never in actual danger," the observer replied. "Emergency intervention protocols were in place throughout the testing period. No permanent harm was intended or allowed." "Tell that to them," David said, gesturing toward his collection of alien refugees. "They didn't know it was fake. They were scared and alone and counting on me to keep them safe. That's real, regardless of your safety protocols." The Council observer was quiet for a long moment, studying David with what might have been new understanding. "Perhaps that is precisely what makes your species unique. You responded to the emotional reality of the situation rather than the actual level of physical threat. Your protective instincts engaged based on perceived need rather than confirmed danger." "We call it basic human decency," David replied. "When kids are scared and need help, you help them. It's not complicated." The formal Council decision came later, after David and his rescued aliens had been transported to proper medical facilities and comfortable quarters. Humanity was not only accepted into the Galactic Council, but granted a special mandate that had never been offered to any species before. Earth would serve as the Council's primary child welfare authority, with humans taking responsibility for protecting young beings across known space. David found himself appointed as the first human protector, with authority to respond to any situation involving endangered alien young throughout the galaxy. It was a responsibility that should have terrified him. But as he watched his rescued aliens playing together in their new home, he felt only a deep sense of rightness. The kits had been reunited with their pack leaders, who expressed amazement that their young had survived by trusting an alien. The flow children swam in crystal-clear pools while their pod elders sang gratitude songs in harmonies that made the air shimmer. The crystal children resonated with pure joy as their deep singer mentors arrived to continue their education. But they all made a point of visiting David regularly, maintaining the bonds formed during their impossible journey across a dying world. They called him by different names in their various languages, but the translations were remarkably consistent. Big Protector, Safety Bringer, the one who carries others home. Standing in the Council chambers 3 months later, David received his first official assignment as humanity's Galactic Protector. Reports of missing young on a distant colony world, situation unknown, rescue mission priority Alpha. He smiled as he read the details. Somewhere in the galaxy, children needed help. That was what humans did. They carried every single one to safety,